The origins and development of psychology. As a formal academic discipline with its own methods, institutions, and theoretical frameworks, is a relatively recent creation. Its founding is conventionally placed in the year 1879, when the German physiologist and philosopher Wilhelm Wundt established the first laboratory dedicated to the experimental investigation of psychological phenomena at the University of Leipzig. This event, however, was not the sudden appearance of an entirely new field of inquiry. It was, rather, the culmination of a long and complicated intellectual history stretching back to ancient Greece, passing through centuries of philosophical speculation, medical observation, and theological debate, and converging in the 19th century with developments in physiology, physics, and evolutionary biology that made the experimental study of the mind seem both possible and necessary. To understand the origins of psychology is to trace a winding path through some of the most persistent questions in human intellectual history, questions about the nature of the mind, the relationship between mental and physical processes, the sources of human behavior, and the causes of mental suffering. The ancient Greeks were among the first in the Western tradition to approach questions about the mind in a systematic and analytical way. Hippocrates of Kos, who lived during the 5th and 4th centuries before the Common Era and who is traditionally regarded as the father of Western medicine, proposed that mental disorders were diseases of the brain rather than punishments sent by the gods, or signs of divine possession. This claim, which may seem obvious to a modern reader, was in its historical context a radical departure from the prevailing understanding of mental illness, and it established a principle that would eventually become one of the foundational assumptions of psychiatry and clinical psychology. Hippocrates identified a number of conditions recognizable to modern clinicians, including epilepsy, which he described as a disease of the brain, and what he called melancholia, a state of persistent sadness and fear that he attributed to an excess of black bile in the body. The humoral theory of temperament, which Hippocrates and his followers developed and which was subsequently elaborated by the physician Galen in the 2nd century of the Common Era, proposed that the character and mental state of an individual were determined by the relative proportions of four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. An excess of blood was associated with a sanguine temperament, marked by cheerfulness and sociability. An excess of phlegm produced a phlegmatic character, slow-moving and unemotional. An excess of yellow bile was associated with a choleric temperament, quick to anger and energetic. An excess of black bile produced melancholy, a tendency toward sadness, fearfulness, and deep contemplative thought. The four temperaments derived from this theory remained a widely used framework for describing individual differences in personality and mood from antiquity through the Renaissance and beyond, and traces of this vocabulary persist in everyday language to the present day. Plato, writing in the 4th century before the Common Era, proposed a tripartite division of the soul into a rational part, located in the head, an emotional part, located in the chest, and an appetitive part, located in the abdomen. These three parts were understood to be in constant tension with one another, and the health of the individual, both physical and moral, depended on the proper governance of the lower parts by the rational part. Plato's model of the soul introduced into Western thought a hierarchical conception of mental life, in which reason is valued above emotion and appetite, a conception that would be enormously influential in subsequent centuries, and that continues to shape popular and scientific thinking about the relationship between cognition and emotion. His student Aristotle offered a somewhat different account of the soul, defining it as the form of the living body, that which makes a body alive and capable of its characteristic functions, and analyzing its capacities in terms of nutrition, sensation, locomotion, and thought. Aristotle's empirical approach to the study of living things, his interest in observation and classification, and his detailed analyses of perception, memory, emotion, and imagination make him in some respects the earliest figure in the history of what would become experimental psychology. The medieval period in European intellectual history was characterized by the integration of ancient philosophical and medical thought with Christian theological frameworks, and the study of the soul during this period was conducted primarily within the context of theology and natural philosophy. Thomas Aquinas, the Dominican friar and philosopher of the 13th century, produced an extensive synthesis of Aristotelian psychology and Christian theology in which the soul was understood as the principle of life in the body. and the rational soul of the human being was distinguished from the souls of animals by its capacity for intellectual understanding and its immortality. The detailed discussions of perception, memory, imagination, and intellect in the works of Aquinas and other scholastic philosophers constitute a significant body of psychological analysis, even though their primary purpose was theological rather than scientific. The Islamic world made important contributions to the development of psychological thought during the medieval period, contributions that were transmitted to Europe through Latin translations, and that played a significant role in shaping the scholastic tradition. Ibn Sina, the Persian physician and philosopher known in the Latin West as Avicenna, who lived from 980 to 1037 of the Common Era, produced a comprehensive medical encyclopedia that included detailed accounts of mental illness and its treatment. His description of what he called lovesickness, a condition in which excessive preoccupation with a particular person produced physical symptoms of illness, is one of the earliest systematic accounts of what might today be called an obsessive attachment, and his method of diagnosis, which involved taking the patient's pulse while reciting the names of different people and places, has been described as a precursor of the word association techniques, developed by later psychologists. Ibn Rushd, the Spanish Arabic philosopher known as Averroes, produced influential commentaries on Aristotle's psychological writings that were widely read in medieval European universities and contributed to the development of scholastic psychology. The Renaissance and the early modern period brought significant changes to the intellectual context, in which questions about the mind were discussed. The revival of interest in ancient texts, the development of printing, the Reformation and its challenges to ecclesiastical authority, and the beginnings of the scientific revolution all created new conditions for intellectual inquiry and new pressures on traditional frameworks for understanding the mind. René Descartes, the French philosopher and mathematician of the 17th century, proposed an influential dualistic account of the relationship between mind and body that would set the terms of psychological debate for several centuries. In Descartes' view, the human being consisted of two entirely distinct substances: the body, a material mechanism subject to the laws of physics, and the mind, an immaterial thinking substance whose essential characteristic was thought. The interaction between these two substances was explained, somewhat unsatisfactorily, by reference to the pineal gland, a small structure at the base of the brain through which, Descartes proposed, the mind exerted its influence on the body. Descartes was also interested in the mechanisms of the nervous system, and conducted detailed studies of animal physiology in an attempt to understand how the body produced automatic responses to stimulation without the involvement of the mind. His account of reflex action, in which he proposed that the nervous system functioned by means of a fluid called animal spirits, flowing through hollow nerves, was an important step in the development of a mechanistic account of nervous function, even though the specific hydraulic model he proposed was subsequently superseded by a different understanding of neural transmission. The Cartesian framework, with its sharp distinction between mind and body and its mechanistic account of bodily function, exerted a powerful influence on the subsequent development of both physiology and psychology, and the problems it generated, particularly the mind-body problem and the problem of how mental events are related to physical processes in the brain, continue to be central concerns of contemporary philosophy of mind and cognitive neuroscience. John Locke, the English philosopher of the late 17th and early 18th centuries, proposed a very different account of the mind that would be equally influential in shaping subsequent psychological thought, where Descartes had argued that the mind contained innate ideas, concepts not derived from experience but present in the mind from birth. Locke argued that the mind at birth was a tabula rasa, a blank slate with no innate content, and that all knowledge was derived from experience. In Locke's view, the mind acquired its content through two sources: sensation, the impression of qualities of the external world on the sense organs, and reflection, the mind's observation of its own operations. Locke's empiricism, as his philosophical position came to be called, established an agenda for the study of the mind that emphasized the role of experience in shaping mental content and the importance of careful observation of mental processes, an agenda that would be central to the development of experimental psychology. In the 19th century, the Scottish philosopher David Hume, writing in the mid-18th century, carried Locke's empiricist program further in a direction that raised fundamental questions about the nature of the self and the basis of knowledge. Hume argued that when he introspected, He found not a unified self but only a succession of distinct perceptions, a bundle of impressions and ideas without any underlying substance to hold them together. The implication of this analysis was that the self, as a unified and continuous entity, was a construction of the mind rather than a feature of reality, a suggestion that anticipates in some respects the later findings of cognitive science about the constructed and often illusory nature of the sense of self. Hume's analysis of causation, in which he argued that our belief in causal connections between events was not justified by reason, but was rather a product of custom and habit, raised questions about the grounds of scientific inference that continued to be discussed in philosophy of science. The 18th century also saw the development of a new interest in the systematic description and classification of mental disorders. William Cullen, the Scottish physician, coined the term neurosis in 1769 to refer to a class of disorders of sensation and movement for which no organic cause could be found. Philippe Pinel, the French physician who became director of the Bicêtre Hospital in Paris during the period of the French Revolution, undertook a systematic reform of the treatment of the mentally ill that is often described as one of the founding moments of modern psychiatry. Pinel is famous for ordering the removal of the chains from patients at the Bicêtre and later at the Salpêtrière Hospital, though more recent historical scholarship has suggested that some aspects of this celebrated story may be apocryphal. What is certain is that Pinel introduced a more systematic and humane approach to the classification and treatment of mental disorders, which he described in his influential treatise on mental alienation published in 1801. The 19th century was the period in which the conditions were created for the emergence of psychology as an independent experimental science. Several converging developments made this possible. The first was the rapid progress of physiology as an experimental discipline, particularly the physiology of the nervous system. Johannes Müller, the German physiologist, formulated the doctrine of specific nerve energies in the 1830s, arguing that the quality of a sensation depends not on the nature of the stimulus, but on the specific nerve that is stimulated. This principle had important implications for the psychology of perception, since it implied that the qualities of experience are in part a product of the structure of the nervous system, rather than simply a reflection of external reality. Hermann von Helmholtz, one of Müller's students and one of the most important scientists of the 19th century, made fundamental contributions to the physiology of vision and hearing that were directly relevant to the emerging science of psychology. Helmholtz measured the speed of neural transmission in motor nerves, demonstrating that it was far slower than the speed of electricity, and resolving a debate about whether neural transmission was an instantaneous process or one that took measurable time. This finding was significant for psychology because it implied that mental processes, which depended on neural transmission, took time to occur and could in principle be measured. Helmholtz also conducted extensive experimental studies of color vision and the perception of musical tones, developing influential theoretical accounts of both that drew on both physical and physiological evidence. The second major development that contributed to the emergence of experimental psychology was the development of psychophysics, the systematic study of the relationship between physical stimuli and psychological experience. Ernst Weber, a German physiologist, discovered in the 1830s that the just noticeable difference in a sensation, the smallest difference in stimulus intensity that a person can reliably detect, is a constant proportion of the original stimulus rather than a constant absolute quantity. This relationship, which became known as Weber's law, established for the first time a precise mathematical relationship between a physical quantity and a psychological experience, and it suggested that the relationship between mind and body could be studied with the tools of exact science. Gustav Theodor Fechner, a German philosopher and physicist who had a profound and somewhat eccentric intellectual life, extended Weber's work into a general theory of the relationship between mind and matter that he called psychophysics. Fechner's major work, The Elements of Psychophysics, published in 1860, described a series of experimental methods for measuring sensory thresholds and formulated what became known as Fechner's law, a mathematical expression of the relationship between stimulus intensity and perceived magnitude. Fechner's path to psychophysics was unusual and personally significant. He had trained as a physicist and had made important contributions to the study of electricity in his early career, but in the 1830s he suffered a prolonged period of illness, including severe eye trouble brought on by his staring at the sun while conducting experiments on afterimages that left him unable to work for several years and that produced what he described as a period of profound spiritual and intellectual transformation. During this period of illness and isolation, he developed the philosophical ideas that would eventually lead him to psychophysics, including the conviction that the entire universe was animated by mind, and that the relationship between mental and physical processes could be expressed in exact mathematical terms. His recovery from illness, which he experienced as a kind of miraculous rebirth, reinforced his sense that he had been given a special mission to demonstrate the unity of mind and matter through scientific investigation. This personal and somewhat mystical dimension of Fichtner's intellectual biography is rarely emphasized in standard accounts of the history of psychology, but it shaped in important ways the motivations and assumptions that led him to develop the methods and concepts that would become central to the new experimental psychology. Wilhelm Wundt, who is conventionally credited with founding psychology as an independent experimental discipline, was born in 1832 in the German state of Baden. He studied medicine and physiology, eventually becoming an assistant to Helmholtz at Heidelberg, where he worked for several years, before establishing himself as a professor of philosophy at Leipzig. Wundt's decision to found a laboratory of experimental psychology at Leipzig in 1879 was not an isolated act of individual initiative, but reflected a broader movement in German academic life toward the experimental investigation of mental processes. The laboratory attracted students from around the world, many of whom went on to found their own psychological laboratories and to establish the discipline in their home countries. Among the students who trained with Wundt were G. Stanley Hall, who established the first psychological laboratory in the United States at Johns Hopkins University, and who became the first president of the American Psychological Association, and James McKeen Cattell, who introduced the study of individual differences into experimental psychology, and who coined the term mental test. Wundt's approach to psychology, which he called physiological psychology, was based on the method of controlled introspection, in which trained observers reported their conscious experiences under carefully controlled experimental conditions. Wundt believed that psychology should study the immediate contents of consciousness, the basic elements of mental life, and the laws by which these elements combine to form complex mental states. This approach, which became known as structuralism in the hands of his student Edward Titchener, was the dominant paradigm of experimental psychology in the late 19th century, though it was subsequently challenged by a variety of alternative approaches. Edward Titchener, an Englishman who trained with Wundt and then spent the rest of his career at Cornell University in the United States, was the most rigorous and systematic proponent of structuralist psychology. Titchener insisted on a strict distinction between psychology, the study of mental experience as such, and the study of the behavioral and physiological correlates of mental processes, and he developed an elaborate taxonomy of mental elements that was intended to map the contents of consciousness in the same way that chemistry had mapped the elements of matter. Titchener's approach to introspection was extremely demanding, requiring observers to undergo extensive training before their reports could be accepted as data, and the disagreements between trained introspectors at different laboratories about the results of apparently similar experiments created serious methodological problems that contributed to the eventual decline of the structuralist approach. William James, the American philosopher and psychologist who published his monumental Principles of Psychology in 1890, offered a very different conception of psychology from that of Wundt and Titchener. James was skeptical of the attempt to analyze consciousness into elementary components, arguing that such an approach distorted the actual character of mental life, which he described as a continuous flow of experience, a stream of consciousness rather than a collection of discrete elements. James's functional approach to psychology, which emphasized the adaptive purposes of mental processes rather than their structural composition, was deeply influenced by the Darwinian framework that had transformed biology. In the second half of the 19th century, if mental processes had evolved because they contributed to the survival and reproduction of organisms, then the interesting question to ask about them was not what they were composed of, but what they were for. James had a complicated relationship with his own mental health that shaped his intellectual development in important ways. As a young man, he suffered from prolonged periods of depression and existential despair, including a crisis in 1870 during which he experienced what he described as a sudden feeling of existential terror. a vision of an epileptic patient he had seen in an asylum that merged with a terrifying apprehension of the fragility of his own mental stability. He overcame this crisis partly through an act of will, deciding to believe in the efficacy of free will as a practical necessity, even if its metaphysical status remained uncertain, an experience that gave him a lasting interest in the psychology of belief, will, and the self. His chapter on habit in the Principles of Psychology, in which he described the nervous system as an accumulator of experience that gradually fixed patterns of behavior into automatic routines, anticipated many of the concerns of behavioral psychology. His discussions of emotion, in which he proposed, along with the Danish physiologist Carl Lang, that emotions were the perception of bodily changes rather than the cause of those changes, generated a controversy that has continued in various forms in effective neuroscience to the present day. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the development of several alternative approaches to psychology that challenged the introspectionist tradition. One of the most influential was the psychoanalytic movement founded by Sigmund Freud. Freud was born in 1856 in the Moravian town of Freiburg, in what is now the Czech Republic, and grew up in Vienna, where he spent most of his professional life. He trained as a physician and initially pursued a career in neurological research, working in the laboratory of Ernst Birch at the University of Vienna on the nervous systems of various animals. His ambitions for an academic research career were frustrated by the limited opportunities available to Jewish scientists in Vienna at the time, and he eventually established himself in private practice as a neurologist, treating patients with nervous disorders. Freud's path toward the development of psychoanalysis began with his collaboration with the Viennese physician Joseph Breuer, who had developed a treatment for hysterical symptoms that involved encouraging patients to talk about the circumstances under which their symptoms had first appeared. Breuer found that when patients were able to recall and articulate the emotional experiences associated with the onset of their symptoms, often under hypnosis, the symptoms would sometimes disappear. Freud adopted and modified this cathartic method, eventually replacing hypnosis with free association, a technique in which the patient was encouraged to say whatever came to mind without censorship or selection. The interpretation of the material produced by free association, along with the analysis of dreams, slips of the tongue, and other apparent failures of ordinary mental functioning, became the primary methods of the psychoanalytic approach. Freud's theoretical framework, which he developed and revised over several decades, proposed that mental life was governed by processes of which the individual was largely unaware, processes that operated according to different principles from those of conscious, rational thought. The unconscious, in Freud's account, was not simply the inactive residue of past experience but an active system with its own logic, its own desires, and its own mechanisms for influencing conscious thought and behavior. The most fundamental motivation in the unconscious was sexual, a claim that was deeply controversial in the cultural context of Finde Psycho Vienna, and that generated enormous resistance among both the medical establishment and the general public. Freud understood this resistance as itself a manifestation of the psychological processes he was describing, a form of repression in which unacceptable ideas were prevented from reaching consciousness. The development of the psychoanalytic movement was marked by a series of defections and schisms that produced a variety of alternative theories derived from, but diverging from Freud's original framework. Alfred Adler, an early member of Freud's Vienna Circle, broke with Freud in 1911 over the latter's insistence on the primacy of sexuality as a motivating force. Adler developed an alternative theory that emphasized the drive for power and superiority as the fundamental motivation of human behavior, and he introduced the concept of the inferiority complex, the sense of inadequacy that he believed was a universal feature of childhood experience and a primary driver of adult behavior. Adler's approach, which he called individual psychology, was more socially oriented than Freud's and placed greater emphasis on the role of conscious goals and social relationships in shaping personality. Carl Gustav Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who was for a time Freud's closest colleague and designated intellectual heir, broke with Freud in 1913 in a rupture that was deeply painful to both men, and that generated some of the most extensive correspondence and retrospective analysis in the history of psychology. Jung's disagreements with Freud were both theoretical and personal. Theoretically, Jung resisted Freud's insistence on the sexual interpretation of libido, arguing that libido was a more general psychic energy that could manifest in many different forms. He also developed a conception of the unconscious that differed significantly from Freud's, proposing a distinction between the personal unconscious, containing material specific to the individual's own experience, and the collective unconscious, a deeper layer of the psyche shared by all human beings and containing the inherited residue of the psychological experience of the species. The contents of the collective unconscious, which Jung called archetypes, were not specific memories but universal patterns or tendencies to form certain types of image and experience. Jung's own mental life was highly unusual and provided much of the raw material for his theoretical elaborations. In the years following his break with Freud, he underwent what he later described as a confrontation with the unconscious, a prolonged period of intense psychological disturbance, during which he deliberately induced states of trance and visionary experience. In order to explore the contents of the unconscious psyche, he recorded his visions and conversations with imaginal figures in a series of illustrated manuscripts, the most important of which was the Red Book, not published until 2009, a richly illustrated volume combining text and elaborate painted images that represents one of the most extraordinary documents of psychological self-exploration in history. Jung's theoretical concepts, including introversion and extroversion, the persona, the shadow, the anima and animus, and the process of individuation, have had a wide influence extending well beyond academic psychology into literature, religion, organizational psychology, and popular culture. The behaviorist movement, which emerged in the United States in the second decade of the 20th century, represented a sharp reaction against both the introspectionist tradition of Wundt and Titchener and the psychoanalytic emphasis on unconscious mental processes. John Brodus Watson, an American psychologist at Johns Hopkins University, published a manifesto for the new approach in 1913 in an article titled Psychology, as the Behaviorist Views It, in which he argued that psychology should abandon the study of consciousness entirely and restrict itself to the observation and measurement of behavior. Watson's argument was methodological as well as philosophical, since consciousness was accessible only through introspection, and since introspective reports could not be independently verified or subjected to the kind of intersubjective checks that were standard in the physical sciences. The study of consciousness could never achieve the status of a rigorous science. The study of behavior, on the other hand, was in principle fully objective and publicly verifiable. Watson's own research career combined experimental work on animal behavior, particularly studies of conditioned responses derived from the work of the Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov, with studies of infant behavior and emotional development. His famous experiment with an 11-month-old infant known in the literature as Little Albert, in which Watson and his research assistant Rosalie Rayner conditioned the child to fear a white rat by pairing its presentation with a loud, frightening noise, was intended to demonstrate that emotional responses were learned through conditioning, rather than being innate. The experiment, which would be entirely unacceptable by modern ethical standards, produced the conditioned fear response Watson had predicted, and he claimed that Albert continued to show fear of the rat and of similar objects, even after the conditioning sessions had ended. The ethical problems of the experiment have been extensively discussed, and more recent scholarship has raised questions about Watson's interpretation of Albert's behavior, and about the infant's subsequent fate. Watson's personal life was turbulent and had significant consequences for his career. In 1920, he divorced his wife to marry Rosalie Rayner, his collaborator in the Little Albert experiment, a scandal that forced his resignation from Johns Hopkins and effectively ended his academic career. He spent the rest of his professional life in advertising, applying behavioral principles to the design of advertising campaigns with considerable success. Despite this unconventional trajectory, Watson's influence on academic psychology was substantial, and the behaviorist paradigm he established dominated American experimental psychology. For several decades, Ivan Pavlov, whose work on conditioned reflexes provided the experimental foundation for behaviorism, was a Russian physiologist who won the Nobel Prize in Physiology in 1904. For his work on the digestive glands, Pavlov had not set out to study psychology and regarded himself primarily as a physiologist. But his discovery that dogs could be conditioned to salivate at the sound of a bell that had been repeatedly paired with the presentation of food redirected the latter part of his career toward the study of what he called higher nervous activity. Pavlov worked with extraordinary systematic thoroughness, training generations of students in his laboratory outside St. Petersburg and accumulating an enormous body of data on the conditions under which conditioned responses were formed, maintained, and extinguished. His concepts of conditioning, extinction, generalization, and discrimination provided the basic vocabulary for the behavioral analysis of learning, and his insistence on the strict physiological interpretation of psychological phenomena established a model of reductionist explanation that influenced the development of neuroscience, as well as psychology. Burroughs Frederick Skinner, the American psychologist who became the most influential figure in behaviorism after Watson, extended the behaviorist program in important ways and developed a comprehensive theory of behavior based on the concept of operant conditioning, where Pavlov's conditioning involved automatic reflexive responses to stimuli. Skinner's operant conditioning concerned the modification of voluntary behavior. Through its consequences, Skinner proposed that behavior was shaped by its outcomes, specifically by positive reinforcement, the presentation of a pleasant stimulus following a behavior, negative reinforcement, the removal of an unpleasant stimulus following a behavior, and punishment, the presentation of an unpleasant stimulus or removal of a pleasant one following a behavior. By systematically controlling the schedules by which reinforcers were delivered, Skinner showed that he could produce a wide variety of behavioral patterns in animals, and he argued that the same principles applied to human behavior. Skinner was a committed and, in some respects, militant materialist who rejected any reference to internal mental states in the explanation of behavior, regarding such references as unscientific because they postulated unobservable entities. His commitment to this position led him to write a highly controversial book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity, published in 1971, in which he argued that the concepts of freedom and dignity, as they were ordinarily understood, were obstacles to the development of a science of human behavior and to the rational design of human societies. The book generated enormous controversy and was attacked from many directions, but it represented a consistent application of the philosophical principles that had always underlain the behaviorist program. Skinner's personal life included some unusual experiments in applied behavioral engineering. He designed a climate-controlled box for the care of his infant daughter Deborah, which he called the air crib, a device intended to provide a comfortable and stimulating environment for the baby, while reducing the physical burden of infant care. The air crib was subsequently misrepresented in popular accounts as a device for conditioning the infant in the manner of laboratory animals, and a persistent legend developed claiming that Deborah had suffered psychological damage as a result of being raised in it. Deborah Skinner Busen, who became a successful artist, spent considerable effort in later life correcting these misrepresentations, and the air crib is now understood by historians as simply an early attempt at rational infant care design rather than an experiment in behavioral engineering. The Gestalt movement in psychology, which developed in Germany in the early 20th century primarily through the work of Max Wertheimer, Wolfgang Klür, and Kurt Kafka, offered a fundamental challenge to the elementarist assumptions that had characterized both the structuralist and the behaviorist traditions. The central claim of Gestalt psychology was that perception and other mental processes were organized according to principles that could not be derived from the properties of individual elements, but emerged from the relationships between elements in a larger configuration. The German word Gestalt means form or configuration, and the Gestalt psychologists argued that the organized whole was not reducible to the sum of its parts. Wertheimer's studies of apparent motion, in which he demonstrated that the perception of movement could be produced by the successive presentation of stationary stimuli, provided the initial empirical basis for the Gestalt approach, and suggested that the experience of motion was a product of the perceptual system's organization of stimuli rather than a simple reflection of physical reality. Wolfgang Klür conducted a series of influential studies of problem-solving in chimpanzees at the Prussian Academy of Sciences research station on the island of Tenerife, where he was stationed at the outbreak of the First World War. Klür found that chimpanzees were capable of solving problems that required a sudden reorganization of the perceptual field, grasping a distant piece of fruit by joining two sticks together, or by stacking boxes to reach an item suspended above them. He described this capacity as insight, a sudden restructuring of the problem situation that was qualitatively different from the gradual trial and error learning that had been described by Thorndike and the behaviorists. Klur's account of insight learning introduced a new concept into the vocabulary of learning theory. and raised questions about the adequacy of purely associationist accounts of learning that would continue to be debated for decades. Kurt Lewin, a member of the Gestalt school who subsequently developed his own distinctive approach known as field theory, made important contributions to social psychology and to what became known as action research. Lewin fled Nazi Germany in 1933 and settled in the United States, where he conducted influential studies of leadership styles, group dynamics, and the conditions under which social attitudes could be changed. His experimental comparison of the effects of autocratic, democratic, and laissez-faire leadership on the behavior of groups of children, conducted in the late 1930s, was one of the first systematic experimental studies of social influence and became a landmark in the history of social psychology. Jean Piaget, the Swiss developmental psychologist, spent most of his career studying the cognitive development of children and produced a body of theoretical and empirical work that transformed the understanding of child development and had a profound influence on education. Piaget began his career as a biologist and brought a biological perspective to the study of cognitive development, proposing that intelligence was a form of biological adaptation, and that cognitive development proceeded through a series of qualitatively distinct stages, each characterized by a different mode of understanding the world. The sensoromotor stage, lasting from birth to approximately 2 years, was characterized by the infant's progressive construction of an understanding of the physical world through sensory and motor interaction. The pre-operational stage, from roughly 2 to 7 years, was characterized by the development of symbolic thought, but by systematic limitations in logical reasoning. The concrete operational stage, from roughly 7 to 11 years, was characterized by the ability to perform logical operations on concrete, tangible objects and situations. The formal operational stage, beginning in adolescence, was characterized by the ability to reason abstractly and to consider hypothetical possibilities. Piaget's method of studying children's thinking, which he called the clinical method, involved extended, flexible conversations with individual children, in which he explored their understanding of various concepts and problems by following the child's own lines of reasoning, rather than imposing a predetermined set of questions. This approach produced a rich and detailed picture of children's thinking that differed in important ways from the understanding of adults. And Piaget's descriptions of children's thinking have become part of the common vocabulary of education and developmental psychology. His finding that young children failed to conserve the amount of a substance when it was transformed in appearance, for example, understanding that the amount of water in a short, wide glass remained the same when it was poured into a tall, thin glass, was one of the most replicated findings in developmental psychology, though its interpretation has been disputed by subsequent researchers who argued that children's performance on conservation tasks was affected by features of the experimental situation that had nothing to do with their underlying cognitive competence. The humanistic psychology movement, which emerged in the United States in the 1950s and 60s largely in reaction against what its proponents saw as the reductionism and determinism of both behaviorism and psychoanalysis, emphasized the unique qualities of human experience, including consciousness, agency, creativity, and the capacity for personal growth. Abraham Maslow, the American psychologist who was one of the founding figures of humanistic psychology, proposed a hierarchical model of human motivation in which basic physiological and safety needs had to be satisfied before higher needs for belonging, esteem, and self-actualization could become operative. Maslow's concept of self-actualization, which he described as the tendency to fulfill one's potential and to become the most complete, fullest expression of oneself, was derived partly from the work of the humanistic psychologist Kurt Goldstein, and partly from Maslow's own study of what he called exemplary individuals, people he believed had achieved an unusual degree of psychological health and fulfillment. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, represented in diagrams as a pyramid with physiological needs at the base and self-actualization at the apex, became one of the most widely reproduced models in the history of psychology and has been applied in countless educational, organizational, and therapeutic contexts. Maslow himself was skeptical of some of the more schematic applications of his model and acknowledged that the hierarchical ordering of needs was not as strict in practice as the pyramid representation suggested. His concept of peak experiences, moments of intense happiness, meaning, and connectedness that he believed were characteristic of self-actualizing individuals, introduced into psychology a concern with the positive aspects of human experience that anticipated the later development of positive psychology. Carl Rogers, another founding figure of humanistic psychology, developed an approach to psychotherapy known as client-centered therapy, later called person-centered therapy, which differed from both psychoanalysis and behavioral therapies in its emphasis on the therapeutic relationship. Rather than specific techniques, Rogers proposed that the conditions necessary for psychological growth were provided by a therapeutic relationship characterized by three core qualities in the therapist: unconditional positive regard for the client, empathy, an accurate and empathic understanding of the client's experience, and congruence, genuineness and transparency in the therapist's own experience and communication. Rogers was the first psychotherapist to make recordings of therapy sessions and to subject them to systematic research, and his work contributed significantly to the development of psychotherapy research as an empirical discipline. The cognitive revolution in psychology, which is generally dated to the late 1950s and 1960s, represented a fundamental transformation of the discipline that displaced behaviorism from its dominant position and established the study of mental processes, including attention, memory, reasoning, and language, as the central concerns of experimental psychology. The cognitive revolution was driven by several converging developments. The work of Noam Chomsky, the American linguist, demonstrated that the behaviorist account of language acquisition was fundamentally inadequate, since children acquired complex grammatical structures far more rapidly than could be explained by conditioning and imitation, implying that the human mind was equipped with an innate language acquisition device. The development of computer science and information theory provided new metaphors and models for understanding mental processes, and the concept of the mind as an information processing system offered a way of studying mental processes rigorously, without committing to either the behaviorist rejection of mental states or the introspectionist assumption that consciousness was directly accessible through verbal report. George Miller, the American cognitive psychologist, published a landmark paper in 1956 titled The Magical Number 7, Plus or Minus 2, in which he described the limited capacity of short-term memory and introduced the concept of chunking, the grouping of individual items into higher-level units that could extend the effective capacity of short-term memory. Miller's paper was one of the earliest and most influential products of the cognitive approach, and contributed to the development of what became known as cognitive load theory, an account of the constraints on learning and performance imposed by the limited capacity of working memory. The development of cognitive neuropsychology, which studied the disruption of cognitive processes by brain damage, provided another important source of evidence for cognitive theories of mental function. The case of Henry Molaison, known for decades in the scientific literature only by his initials H.M. to protect his privacy, became one of the most important case studies in the history of psychology and neuroscience. Molaison underwent a surgical operation in 1953 in which his hippocampus and surrounding structures were removed bilaterally in an attempt to control severe epilepsy. Following the operation, he was unable to form new long-term memories, while retaining his personality, intelligence, and memories from before the surgery, a condition known as anterograde amnesia. His case provided compelling evidence for the role of the hippocampus in the formation of long-term declarative memories, and the decades of research conducted on him by Brenda Milner and subsequent researchers contributed enormously to the understanding of memory and its neural substrates. Molaison died in 2008, and his real name was revealed to the public following his death. The neuroscience revolution of the late 20th and early 21st centuries transformed the context in which psychological research was conducted by providing new methods for studying the relationship between brain function and psychological processes. The development of functional magnetic resonance imaging in the early 1990s allowed researchers to observe changes in blood flow in different regions of the brain, while participants performed cognitive tasks, providing a window into the neural correlates of mental processes that had been unavailable to earlier generations of researchers. This technology generated enormous enthusiasm and a vast body of research in the field. Known as cognitive neuroscience, the study of the neural basis of cognition, it also generated important methodological debates about the interpretation of neuroimaging data, and about the risk of what critics called reverse inference, reasoning from the activation of a brain region back to the presence of a specific psychological process on the basis of assumptions about the function of that region that might not be well established. The development of positive psychology, a movement launched by the American psychologist Martin Seligman in his presidential address to the American Psychological Association in 1998, represented an attempt to redirect psychological research toward the study of well-being, flourishing, and the conditions that promote positive human development, rather than the traditional focus on pathology and disorder. Seligman had spent much of his earlier career studying learned helplessness, a condition in which repeated exposure to inescapable negative events produces a generalized passivity and failure to take initiative, even when effective action becomes possible. His work on learned helplessness was influential in the development of cognitive theories of depression and eventual reorientation of his research program toward the study of positive psychology, represented in some ways a personal as well as intellectual journey, from a focus on what goes wrong with human functioning to a focus on what makes it go well. The replication crisis that erupted in psychology beginning in the early 2010s raised fundamental questions about the reliability of a substantial body of published psychological research. The Open Science Collaboration, a large consortium of researchers, published a study in 2015 in which they attempted to replicate the results of 100 published psychology studies, and found that only approximately 40% produced results consistent with the original findings. This finding generated intense discussion about the methodological practices that had allowed unreliable findings to accumulate in the published literature, including the role of small sample sizes, flexible data analysis practices, the tendency of journals to publish positive results more readily than negative ones, and the institutional pressures that encouraged researchers to report clean and dramatic findings, rather than equivocal or null results. The replication crisis led to a significant movement for methodological reform in psychology, including the pre-registration of studies before they were conducted, the public sharing of data and materials, the adoption of higher statistical standards, and the replication of important findings as a normal part of the research process. Contemporary psychology encompasses an enormous range of research programs, theoretical frameworks, and applied practices, and it is no longer possible to describe the field in terms of any single dominant paradigm. Evolutionary psychology, behavioral genetics, affective neuroscience, computational modeling, cross-cultural psychology, positive psychology, mindfulness research, and social neuroscience are among the many distinct approaches that currently coexist within the discipline. The relationship between psychology and neuroscience continues to evolve, with increasing numbers of researchers working at the interface of the two disciplines, and with ongoing debates about the extent to which psychological phenomena can or should be explained in terms of neural processes. Clinical psychology, the application of psychological knowledge to the assessment and treatment of mental disorders, has undergone significant development since the mid-20th century. The development of cognitive behavioral therapy by Aaron Beck in the 1960s and 1970s, building on earlier work by Albert Ellis, provided an approach to the treatment of depression and anxiety that has been extensively evaluated in randomized controlled trials, and that remains one of the most widely used and empirically supported forms of psychotherapy. The integration of mindfulness practices derived from Buddhist meditation into cognitive behavioral therapy, resulting in what became known as mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, is one of the more recent developments in clinical psychology and represents a distinctive example of the incorporation of non-Western practices into a Western scientific framework. The question of what psychology is, what its proper methods are, and how it relates to neighboring disciplines continues to be actively debated within the field. The history of psychology is in many respects a history of methodological controversy, as different researchers have argued for different conceptions of what counts as psychological evidence, and what kind of explanation counts as genuinely psychological. These debates are not merely academic but have practical consequences for the kinds of research that are conducted, the kinds of conclusions that are drawn, and the kinds of interventions that are developed and applied. The history traced in these pages, from the humoral theories of Hippocrates to the neuroimaging studies of contemporary cognitive neuroscience, is a history of progressive, if not always linear, refinement in the tools and concepts available for the systematic study of the mind, and it is a history that continues to unfold.